Hi, good afternoon. I hope not many of you got wet on the way in here. I apologize for the rain. That had nothing to do with our scheduling. My name is Randy Old, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Adavasio and his summary of the last 4 years of our excavation. But before we get started with that, I'd like to thank a number of people because this effort, this last actually 9-year effort, has included a lot of people that have come together to make this work, and it's important that you all know about the background of that. In about '09, there was going to be a water treatment plant where the site is, and a very important archaeologist in the University of Florida said, this is Barbara Purdy, said, you've got to stop. You've got to stop this plant from being built there and protect the site. And so she encouraged a woman named Susan Grandpierre to step up and form a committee, talk to the city, talk to the county, talk to the airport, and preserve the area which is the site today. And it's preserved and it will not be built on. And she deserves an awful lot of support for that. Is she in the house? Is Susan in the house? No, okay. In the first few years, she built a committee that helped form OVS, and then after that, we looked around for the best archaeologist we could find in the country, someone who's got a firm reputation in archaeology and who knows early man and who the community of archaeology respects. And we found Dr. Adavasio, who's going to speak in just a moment. He was recommended as by far the most qualified person to take on the site. And together with Andy Hemmings, who is a knowledgeable person, PhD on Florida history, Florida archaeology, those two have been running our dig for the last 4 years. We were first affiliated with Mercyhurst University, and then we dug with them for 2 years. Then they decided, with a new president coming in, they decided that archaeology was not going to be their strength, that was not going to be their focus, and so we moved on to FAU Harbor Branch. And Harbor Branch really saved our lives. They put up our archaeologists, they managed our grants, they helped manage our program, and several people, Anna Brady, Megan Davis, Anton Post, were instrumental in making sure that we survived. Without their help, we wouldn't have gotten anywhere. I think Megan is in the audience tonight, isn't she? Megan, would you stand? She really deserves a round of applause. Yeah. And since then, we've moved partly onto Indian River State College, and several people from Indian River State College have been working with us. Kyle Freud, Dr. Kyle Freud, I think he's in the audience, and Rob Lowry, Ed Massey, and Casey Lungsford have been helping us, and so that whole establishment has been helping us a great deal. As we went along through this, another part of the community helped us a great deal, and that was Indian River Water Control District. David Gunter, who is here also, did a tremendous amount for us, using their equipment to help us uncover our excavation, engineering help, all kinds of heavy equipment help that we couldn't have done it without them. Lastly, and not in any small way, a lot of individuals came forward with money. So we raised substantially over $1 million from individuals, and then the state came through with about 5 grants of almost $1 million. So over the last 9 years, we've had tremendous support from the community, all kinds of cogs. If not everybody had come together, this never would have happened. So we have a lot of people to applaud in doing this. So thank everybody. Applause for everybody. Thank you. Thank you. A couple of housekeeping things before I introduce Dr. Adavasio. One is you're not going to need to tape this or record this or anything like that. We are taping it, and we're going to put it on our website, and you'll be able to download it, so you can have a copy of this if you want this talk. And so please turn off your cell phones. The other thing is that we're going to collect cards from people who have questions, and then we'll bring the cards down and we'll ask Dr. Adevez some questions after he's finished. In introducing Dr. Adevezio, he's you've got on your seat a little background on him, but he's been in archaeology for 45 years, written 500 or so books, papers, articles, and things. Very well known. He's very well known for his knowledge of perishables. He's a world expert on that. Plus, Meadowcroft was his main dig in western Pennsylvania. That's a spectacular site, very similar in some ways to the site we've got now. And he's a very good speaker. He's also very good with fast motorcycles. Jim, come on up and talk.
Thank you. Supposedly this mic works. I wanted to second some of the comments that Randy made about the fact that without the amount of support that we have received, both from the Old Vero Ice Age Sites Committee, whose work has been instrumental in preserving this location, and all the universities and colleges that were mentioned, this project could not have gone forward. In point of fact, what I want to do this evening or this afternoon is to try to contextualize the research that was conducted there, give you a little bit of input into what we know about the site. We might have entitled this discussion 4 years, 14 months, or $2 million, so what? And what I would like to do is to give you a little bit about the so what portion of this enterprise. As all of you are aware, and most of my talks about the site start like this, on October the 11th, 1492, about 4 a.m. in the morning, the lookout on the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, spied land, or what he thought was land, and very shortly thereafter, Columbus landed on San Salvador, Samana Cay, and almost immediately encountered its soon-to-be extirpated aboriginal inhabitants, the Taino. About these folks, he or members of his entourage would pose a series of questions which we've been trying to answer ever since, and in point of fact, a series of questions in which the excavations at Vero have played a critical role in trying to answer. They inquired, who are these people? From whence did they come? Via what route or routes did they employ to get here to the New World? Probably most vexatiously, and here's where the Vero site was so controversial, at what point in time did these original inhabitants arrive? And finally, a question which we will not have time to address except tangentially, what were their lifestyles like? What were these first people in the New World actually doing? Within 100 years of Columbus's arrival, several scholars working independently, both churchmen in fact, happened to observe that the homeland of Native Americans was the part of Siberia shown on this map, this National Geographic map, namely northeastern Siberia, and the areas shown in white on that map represent places where continental glaciers existed. As you can see, much of northeastern Asia is unglaciated, but parts of it are glaciated, and each time glaciers affected the northern hemisphere, sea level would drop precipitously, and oftentimes that drop in sea level was on the order of 300 plus feet. And so consequently, areas which are now disconnected were then formally connected. The northernmost island of Japan was connected to the Chinese mainland. The Kamchatka Peninsula was substantially larger than it is presently, and most impressively, this enormous land bridge existed connecting northeastern Asia with Alaska. In a document published in 1594, 100 years after Columbus's arrival, and some considerable number of years since it was demonstrated by Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossing the Isthmus of Panama in 1513, that the New World was indeed a brand new place, and that all the older ideas that may have obtained at the time about where Native Americans could have come from were probably in error. The priest working in Chile and part of Peru, Jose de Acosta, said it's across that land connection shown here that the earliest Aboriginal inhabitants of the New World must have traveled. And in 1648, an Englishman, Thomas Gage, said the same thing. No one paid any attention to either one of these gentlemen, and their argument was based on the fact that, to their eyes at least, Native Americans looked like Northeastern Asians. What's remarkable about both their pronouncements is the fact that they anticipated the geological discoveries that would occur in the 20th century that would actually demonstrate that over the last 2 million or so years, there have been at least 9 periods of glaciation during which sea level rose and fell repetitively, creating these land bridges or these land connections. Remarkably, De Acosta said they walked here, dry-shod, across the Bering platform. And what makes this particularly insightful is the fact that this is 144 years before Vitus Bering would ever sail through the straits which currently bear his name. Consequently, these prognostications, which science has demonstrated to be correct, were absolutely unique for the time frame involved. In the crossing of Beringia, human populations moved gradually and imperceptibly across a connection that was more than 700 kilometers across. Anyone that was moving from Northeastern Asia to Alaska would have never known they were changing continents. Rather, it was a question of what we call range expansion. Humankind had arrived in the part of Siberia I just showed you roughly 35,000 years ago, and at some point thereafter, still undetermined, they managed to get to the very gates, as it were, of the Bering platform. And here you see some individuals wearing items that were necessary for the early occupation of the far north, tailored clothing in the form of pants that had separate legs, jackets with separate sleeves, buttons, toggles, mittens, and what are basically Inuit or Eskimo-style gear on this side of the Bering Straits, or Chukchi or Koryak-style gear on the other side of the Bering Straits. And that's what these gentlemen are wearing in this image as they stare off at that disappearing herd of mammoths under the shimmering lights of the Aurora Borealis. In any case, when this event occurred was highly conjectural. And in fact, De Acosta speculated that the initial peopling of the New World was only 2,500 years before Columbus arrived. Then a series of discoveries would be made so that by the beginning of the 20th century, there was a widespread belief that people had not come to the New World during the last ice age at all. That in fact, this never happened. Instead, that humans arrived after the land bridge had been inundated by the melting of the glaciers sometime after 9,000 years ago, and that they arrived here by boat. If you were alive in 1905 and listened to a lecture about the peopling of the New World, that's what the speaker would have told you, that Native Americans got here by boat sometime in the last 10,000 years max, and probably less than that. Consider the received wisdom in any of your fields. Whether you're a journalist, a pharmacist, a lawyer, there is a body of information that was dispensed to you while you were being educated, and that body of information shaped, for many of you, your careers. Well, at the time that all this is going on in the New World, in other words, in the early 1900s, that received wisdom for archaeologists is what I just told you. People came here very late, and they came by boat. A handful of archaeologists believed otherwise. One of them was Elias Sellards, the state geologist of Florida, who in 1913 circulated word amongst his brethren that he was interested in cataloging fossil finds, Ice Age fossil remains, from various parts of the state of Florida, and some of those remains came out of the initial canal excavations at the Vero locality. Most of you know where the Vero site is located, next to the county buildings, next to the private airport. And this slide is particularly instructive because it shows you what the topography would have been like in 1913 with what is now the channelized Van Valkenburg Creek, which we call Lateral E, the main canal, the area in which Sellards conducted after human remains began to appear alongside, apparently, the Ice Age animal remains, where his excavations occurred. And our own excavations occurred as close to his excavations as we could possibly get. This shows you relative changes in sea level over the last 125,000 years. And you can see at various times that the site of Vero itself was either closer to or further away from the Atlantic Ocean than it is presently. Those changes in sea level parallel the changes I talked about earlier. Each time there are continental glaciers on land, sea level drops. Each time the ice melts, sea level rises, and we are in fact in such an event presently. In any case, you can see on the lower map that it was about 8,000 years ago that the modern coastline of Florida stabilizes to pretty much what it is today. Now, at the time the initial discoveries were made by Sellards of human remains in the banks of the canal, and here you see a human radius coming out. Here you see some of the initial excavations. The claim that those remains represented Ice Age inhabitants of the Vero area specifically, and Indian River County generally, was archaeological heresy. In point of fact, only 5 or 6 archaeologists of the several thousand that were around in North and South America at the time had any idea of an Ice Age human presence. And so the Vero locality became exceptionally controversial. A series of meetings were held here after Sellards conducted his excavations in 1915 and 1916, and the consensus of those meetings essentially was that he had not properly attended to questions which have vexed the site ever since. Questions about the stratigraphic succession at the site, the sequence of layers at the site, which are fundamental to understanding anything about its antiquity. That he had somehow missed whether or not the human remains from the site were actually found with those Ice Age animal bones that had come out of the site both earlier and during his excavations, or were the human remains actually later? And so, to make a long story very short, from that time onward, Vero became, for a brief period, the archaeological center of the North American universe, and then it slipped into a kind of limbo because those questions could not be answered. As was pointed out by Randy in his presentation, were it not for the threats to the site in 2009, and then the activities of the Old Vero Ice Age Sites Committee and interested prehistorians in readdressing parts of the site that were thought to still contain intact, undisturbed sediments, none of what I'm about to tell you would have ever transpired. Here you see a 1920 photo postcard of the main canal and the overbank deposits that have accumulated, it's important to remember that much of this overbank deposit material has accumulated in the last 100 years. And it is not the surface from which Sellards excavated. That is much lower down. And in order for us to resume excavations there, we had to, fortunately for us, use the services of Mr. Gunter and his employees to strip off the overburden to get down to the 1915 ground surface and then to proceed further down in the excavations. At the same time, or roughly the same time, Vero was the epicenter of the archaeological universe. Nearby in Melbourne, there was also claimed to be an association of human skeletal material with Ice Age fauna. And so a second Florida locality were claimed by a small handful of individuals to demonstrate an Ice Age human presence. Unfortunately, because of the problems in answering the criticisms about the stratigraphic succession at the site, the sequence of layers, and the would-be association of those Ice Age remains and the human remains, neither Melbourne nor Vero were thought to be conclusive indications of an Ice Age human presence. Then, in 1909, even before the Vero excavations occurred, a former slave, George McJunkin, a black cowboy, was by that time a ranch manager in New Mexico, and he was out looking for lost cattle in a place dramatically called Wild Horse or Dead Horse Arroyo. Eroding out of the banks of that dry stream, he saw the remains of an animal which he recognized clearly was far larger than any of the bison that still lived in New Mexico at the time, or indeed any form of domestic cattle with which he was familiar. He collected those bones, took them back to his bunkhouse, where they would languish until after World War I, and gradually they were brought to the attention of one of those other archaeologists who, like Sellards, believed in an Ice Age human presence in North America. J.D. Figgins, the curator of paleontology at the Denver Museum of Natural History. Figgins came back to the site of McJunkin's discoveries, conducted excavations, and in 1925 found the remains of a projectile point since called Folsom, after the nearby town of Folsom, New Mexico, literally intercalated with the remains of an extinct Ice Age animal, Bison antiquus. On geological grounds, because this was more than 40 years before radiocarbon dating would be invented, the site was thought to be 10,000 years old. So this became the first archaeological location in the New World that demonstrated an Ice Age human presence, and it became, for a very short time, the benchmark by which the human presence in the New World was reckoned. A few years later, in 1933, at another locality in New Mexico, Blackwater Draw, locality number 3, other excavations in a layer deeper and therefore older than a layer containing Folsom points, projectile points like these were recovered. Named after the nearby town of Clovis, New Mexico, these points were thought to represent the handiwork of the first people that ever came into the New World. In other words, since they were older than Folsom, they had to be older than 10,000 years, and they represented groups that had been, among other things, hunting now extinct Ice Age animals. They also became, these points and their makers, the lead players in a scenario called Clovis First, which was the prevailing theory from 1933 to the early 1970s about not only when people got to the New World, but what they were doing. According to this argument called Clovis First, the makers of those points, with their distinctive channel flakes taken out of the base that by which they can be readily recognized, crossed the Bering Straits about 14,000 years ago, and thereafter, in the space of only 500 radiocarbon years, sprinted to the tip of South America, leaving in their wake 35 genera of Ice Age animals. The greatest killing event in the history of the world, or so American and Canadian male archaeologists thought. Okay? Between 1933 and 1970, more than 500 archaeological locations in North and South America were claimed to be older than the Clovis Horizon. The Clovis Horizon was fixed between about 13,500 and 13,000 calendar years ago, once radiocarbon dating was invented in 1948. Some of the first archaeological material dated was charcoal from Blackwater Draw. So this became, for a brief period, actually for a long period, the new benchmark for a human presence. In the early 1970s, two archaeological sites, one of which I was connected with and am still connected with, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in southwestern Pennsylvania, and Monteverde, 14,000 kilometers to the south in Chile, were excavated, one by the University of Pittsburgh and subsequently Mercyhurst University, and the other by the University of Kentucky and subsequently Vanderbilt University. In any case, these two sites contained clear evidence in the deep deposits at Meadowcroft, and that's more than 16 feet of sediment represented there. Artifacts like these that were decidedly non-Clovis in appearance were dated as early as 16,000 radiocarbon years ago. At Monteverde, which is about 50 kilometers inland from the Pacific Ocean in southern Chile, Tom Dillahay found the remains of a settlement from which came, again, artifacts of a decidedly non-Clovis flavor that were minimally 14,000 radiocarbon years old, if not older. The preservation at that site was truly remarkable, and I want to point out to you here, even though we were not going to be able to talk about it much, that most of us are used to finding stone tools because they are oftentimes preserved in archaeological sites, whereas organic materials seldom are. Because Monteverde was inundated throughout its history, the preservation of things like animal tissue is extraordinary. What you see here is a thin section of breast tissue from a cousin of the mastodon, a gomphothere, represented at this location and also known from the paleontological remains in the state of Florida. This is one of the creatures that existed here during the last ice age. In any case, by the late 1990s, based on the excavations not simply at Meadowcroft and Monteverde, but by then a series of other locations, the Paisley Caves in Oregon, the Galt site in Texas, the Topper site in South Carolina, Cactus Hill in Virginia, and a whole slew of archaeological sites in South America, this model didn't work anymore. It did not work chronologically. It did not work behaviorally. Instead, as I'll point out as we get to the end of this discussion, we now know that humans have been here much longer than the makers of those fluted projectile points, and that they were living lifestyles rather dramatically different. In any case, I became involved in 2014, 2013 with Andy Hemmings and the Old Vero Ice Age Sites Committee to re-excavate the extant portions of the Vero site to try to answer those questions which could not be answered in the early 1900s. We had some strategic goals in that project, and they were to fully understand the stratigraphic, the sequence of layers at the site, to demonstrate or not demonstrate when humans interfaced or related to that geological record, and also to understand as best we could the environmental history of this part of Florida as it might elucidate bigger issues in the history and prehistory of the southeastern United States and eastern North America at large. Here you see one of Mr. Gunter's, or several of Mr. Gunter's pieces of equipment in the process of moving through that overburden to get down to the horizon that would represent the surface of the site at the same time that Sellards was excavating. All this being the last 100 years' worth of introduced material. We learned in the excavations at Meadowcroft that working indoors is the way to go, not only because it provides a respite from the vicissitudes of the weather, but also because it protects the site during the non-excavation season from vandals, both natural in the form of rodents and other activities, and human who might come to the site seeking to collect artifactual materials. And so, using a Hansen Arctic weatherport developed initially for use on the Arctic slope in the construction of some of the pipelines that run from the far north down into the United States across Canada, we erected a weatherport in the site which allowed us to basically work indoors. And here you see the weatherport fully erected down in that basin or bathtub that was effectively created by the use of heavy equipment to remove that overburden. Here you can see that part of the terrace in which the rock shelter or in which the excavations existed. They are close to, but not immediately in the same area as where the excavations conducted by Sellards occurred. Sellards worked in what was basically a prehistoric pond basin. We are working in a dune field adjacent to that pond basin. His discoveries came from this area and this area. Our work was close by, where previous coring using soil augers had demonstrated that the sediments revealed during the 1915-16 excavations were still present and still intact. After we removed the overburden, we switched from power equipment to the use of hand tools, and this is basically where we started. That is the bottom, the very bottom of those sediments that were mechanically removed, and we had to take this out by hand and then continue. The surface you just saw, that surface is this surface. And all of this has been removed using trowels or smaller hand tools, in some cases razor blades, in order to make certain that we understood not only the stratigraphic succession at the site, but that we didn't miss the critical boundaries between layers, or more importantly, the boundaries between the small layers that existed within the larger layers. I always like to use the example of those of you who give yourselves over to the consumption of 17-layered desserts. Not that we do that anymore, right? But in any case, the sequence of events at the Vero site or Meadowcroft or any other deeply stratified site parallels that dessert, in that the oldest layers are the ones laid down first at the bottom, they're the deepest, and subsequently the layers above it were emplaced. The tags that you'll see in these and succeeding slides represent the boundaries between the various layers, and here you see part of the dune field that the excavations occurred in between 2014 and 2015, whereas outside of this structure is pretty much where Sellards conducted his excavations. In any case, well into the 2016 season, this is pretty much what the site looked like. Down here, we're in the process of exposing the deepest of a series of stable events in the site's history which allowed the formation of soils. Those buried soils are called paleosols, and 4 of them can be recognized at the Vero locality. Here you have excavators working with their hand tools through the deposits, and here you have exposed a series of remains of animal bones that represent, before they are taken out, accumulations that are very similar to the ones reported by Sellards. Many different species are represented here. There are 53 mammalian species represented, over 20 of which are now extinct animals. In any case, once those bones are removed, this is pretty much the way we left the site at the end of the excavations in 2017. One of the techniques that was employed to dramatically record the data at the site is called photogrammetry, in which, not via photographs, but by a series of projections, these kinds of images that look like photos can be generated to show in very great detail, in addition to the photographs, the precise location of any and all objects that we encountered. And in this particular instance, you see a lot of bones that date to between roughly 11,000 and 17,000 radiocarbon years ago. Now, I keep saying radiocarbon years ago because a radiocarbon year and a calendar year are not the same thing. Rather, you can calibrate or adjust radiocarbon years in reference to the very precise tree ring calendars in the American Southwest and other proxy data sets, so that we know that, for instance, if we say 11,000 radiocarbon years ago, we're actually talking about 13,000 calendar years ago. And you also know that every living thing, or virtually every living thing, absorbs radiocarbon while they're alive. You maintain a constant reservoir of radiocarbon in your systems. As soon as you expire, that radiocarbon begins to break down at the rate of 1/2 of its mass every 5,730 years. Therefore, by calculating the amount of radiocarbon left in your carcass, we can tell you when you might have died. In any case, over on the right-hand side of this chart, you see the ages of the tops and bottoms of most of the layers that we encountered at the site. On the far left are the terms for those layers as employed by Sellards. And as you can all tell, the earliest radiocarbon dates in which we have any confidence are nearly 30,000 years old, during which time the virolocation is dramatically different than it is at present, and dramatically different than it was at various points in its history. The site was essentially stable. It was considerably open in terms of vegetation. The vegetational community was open. There was standing water in the Vero area, and at various points in the past, that standing water would shrink and expand and ultimately play a very critical role in what humans were doing at this location when they finally get here. This is a composite of the stratigraphy as we recognized it from one small part of the site. Again, the overburden is stratum 8, and from this interface, this contact, at the top of 7 all the way down, you're dealing with sediments that are still essentially as they were when Sellards conducted his excavations. And here you see various episodes of soil formation in the site's history. This episode is the episode within which most of those Ice Age animal bones derive. The earliest evidence of a human presence at this site takes the form of a small, blocky flake found at the base of stratum 7, which is fairly high up in the sequence, which is dated to roughly 6,400 radiocarbon years ago. In other words, it dates from the geological time called the recent or the Holocene. And this represents the oldest artifact from the site about which we can be certain it was manufactured and left by a human because of its physical characteristics. And there's a close-up of that particular flake and that radiocarbon determination. That would be roughly about 7,500 calendar years ago. And keep that number in mind because it's going to be important momentarily. From the overburden, which we think included, at various times in the construction of the canal, wall scrapings and other materials which would have once been in context, we have a lot of artifactual material, most of which belong to the Archaic period of Florida, which dates from roughly the end of the last ice age until about 1,500 calendar years before the beginning of the Common Era. And these are archaic, most of them are middle archaic projectile points, which, like that flake I showed you, date to about 7,500 radiocarbon years ago. In any case, there is a bone veneer that we've been concentrating on since the beginning of the 2016 and 2017 excavations, which suggests that there may have been humans here earlier. That bone veneer consists of thermally altered pieces of bone, and you see one right here, that is in place in stratum 4, and these bones, many of which represent either Bison antiquus, the extinct form of bison in this part of Florida, or the extinct form of tapir, an animal that still lives in South America, are represented in this accumulation. You will also note over here the remains of a pit of human manufacture, the origins of which, in other words, where it starts, is much, much higher up in the sequence and therefore more recent, that cuts down through the layer that contains those Ice Age animal bones. In this series of bones are the remains of tapir, and what we are absolutely certain is the tip of a bone projectile point. And here you see that bone point close up. And this is the critter amongst whose remains that bone point was found. This is an animal also recovered by Sellards, and again, it is locally extinct by 10,000 years ago, and it still lives in attenuated form, obviously, in South America today. In any case, it's this intrusive pit which drew our attention because of its very close resemblance to the pits that had been identified not only at the Melbourne locality in the 1920s, but also at the celebrated Windover site near Cape Canaveral or Cape Kennedy in Florida. And this is the bottom of that pit as it was fully excavated here with a quarter section of the fill still in place. Now again, bear in mind, that pit was cut down from a much higher or later level. The bottom of that pit happens to have gone through the layer containing the Ice Age animal bones, and sad to confess, even with the attention we paid to the excavations, we missed where exactly the top of that pit was. We know it is somewhere in stratum 7, okay? A radiocarbon date from the bottom of that pit came back at 7,400 radiocarbon years ago. So basically, that pit is of relatively more recent age than the apparently associated Ice Age animal bones. Now, as you will recollect from previous discussions, when Sellards conducted his excavations, he also found some bone projectile points, which he claimed were directly associated with the remains of Vero Man, who, like so many of these early skeletons, was actually a woman. But in any case, this particular point was accessible, unlike the human skeletal material found by Sellards, in the Florida Museum of Paleontology. We took a small section of the center of that point and subjected it, after we cast the whole point, and submitted it for radiocarbon dates, because theoretically, if it were actually as old as Sellards claimed, it would in fact be more than 11,000 years old and similar to the age of those extinct animals. As it turned out, that projectile point is less than 7,000 years old. Like so many of the other materials from the site, like this piece of burned braid that was recovered in the deposits, like these textile remains that were found at the site, the dates on them are all Middle Archaic dates, which suggests to us that at least the bulk of the human use of this site occurred much later in time than we hoped or imagined it to have done. In other words, the associations claimed by Sellards between the Ice Age animal bones and the skeletal materials were probably not real. And that, in fact, what we did find relates to an equally interesting phenomenon documented during the 1980 excavations at the Windover Bog, where 179 archaic burials were found tightly clustered in an area which was, at the time the burials were placed, underwater. So that the bodies of these Native Americans were actually being buried by the Aboriginal inhabitants of Florida underwater. They were held underwater by driving stakes through the cloth that was used to enwrap the bodies. This, incidentally, is exactly the same kind of cloth that we dated from the deposits at the old Vero site. In any case, the Windover locality was filled with wooden and bone tools, and this is a small sampling of the wooden tools that were found at Windover, and we have a much smaller assemblage of wooden bone from the Vero locality. We think the human record at the old Vero site begins at a time when the site essentially looks like this. It consists of bodies of water, standing water, separated by dry hummocks of land. And under that water, we believe Native Americans were emplacing bodies in the image shown here. This is a reconstruction of one of the burials at the Windover locality. This particular pattern of burial has been documented at several other sites in Florida, and it may begin as early as 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, shortly after the end of the last ice age, and it is represented in a belt presently that's roughly 100 miles wide across the gut, as it were, of central Florida. In our estimation, understanding this phenomenon is something that will be an object of our future research. But in any case, in the bigger issue, the bigger claim that Sellards made, that humans and Ice Age animals were in fact contemporaries somewhere in Florida, he was absolutely correct. These are some of the critters represented on the Florida landscape. This is a This is a glyptodon. This is a megatherium, a giant ground sloth. This is Holmesina, the first direct dating of which occurred on material from the old Vero site that shows this animal was in fact a contemporary with humans on the Ice Age landscape of Florida. This is the Ice Age horse, the horse that became extinct at the end of the last Ice Age, which would have to be reintroduced when the Spanish arrived. Here is the truly large ground sloth, the Remotherium, the biggest ground sloth that ever existed in North or South America. It's also represented at the Old Vero site, as is Paleo-llama, the ancestor of the modern llama, as are the peccary, still living in parts of North America, and the dire wolf, the ancestor of modern wolves, and of course, our tusked favorites, the mammoth and mastodon, shown here, as well as several predators, in this case, Smilodon fatalis, and one of its prey, Bison antiquus, the ancestor of domestic, or rather, contemporary bison. The American lion is also represented at the Old Vero site, as are still living animals, like white-tailed deer. So when we think about faunal succession, the transition from the Ice Age to the more recent period, some animals make that transition. If not here, they make it somewhere. That's why there are peccaries and tapirs still living in South America. That's why there's white-tailed deer everywhere in North America presently. And it was also one of the Ice Age critters here as well. How do we know Sellards was right? On the left is a projectile point from the Hornbuckle property here in Indian River County of decided Clovis flavor. On the right is a Clovis point from Sloth Hole in Jefferson County in North Florida. These points are at least 13,000 years old, which clearly show that even though he was derided by his critics at the time, Sellards was dead right about an Ice Age human presence here in the state of Florida, even if he had misinterpreted the local evidence at the Old Vero locality itself. And this again represents where we have spent your tax money and your donations over the last 4 years, learning about in intimate detail the changes in Florida climate that have occurred over the last 30,000 years, the alterations of drier and wetter periods, the alterations in the size of the pond and the water supplies that were constantly present at this location, the 195 total number of species of plants and animals represented at the Old Vero site, a vast compendium of information which adds to the work originally conducted by Sellards and which contributes to our understanding ultimately of the timing of the arrival of the first humans in the New World, even if we cannot demonstrate for certitude when they might have arrived at the Old Vero locality. This is the current visitor center at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. It represents part of what we as archaeologists think is our obligation to translate to you, the public, who pay for our work in a very literal sense, why and what we are doing. That's part of what this lecture is all about. It's part of what visitor centers are all about. It's part of what making archaeological sites accessible to the public are effectively all about. Hopefully, at some point in the future, the sum total of remains recovered by us as well as by Sellards from the Old Vero site will be available to be viewed, will be available to tell the story of prehistoric Florida, which is a fascinating subset of a much bigger tale involving the percolation of humans into the New World across the Bering Straits land bridge. We now know that that process was incredibly nuanced, incredibly more complex than anyone ever imagined it to be, that it involved different groups at different times with different technologies and different lifestyles coming over and south of the Bering Straits, some of whom never went into the interior of the New World. They went straight down the Pacific coast into South America, some of whom may have crossed at the Gulf of California and thence up the Colorado River, some of whom may have crossed at Panama and then up the coast, the Atlantic coast, and then around the Gulf Coast and ultimately peopled the United States from that direction. But in any case, what we are learning about the past has been substantially augmented by the research which you guys helped to pay for and which hopefully you understand a little better this evening or this afternoon. Thank you for your attention.
Some questions do we have? Don't we have some cards with some questions on them? The cards are there. Would you pass the cards out? Do we have any questions that are now? Why don't we start with this question over here? Go ahead, sir.
Well, no, the ice
Could
ages...
you repeat the question?
The question is, how many ice ages have there been? Now, the answer to that question takes two forms. One, we have deep sea cores that show alternations of cold moments and warmer moments in the past. Those deep sea cores, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific, seem to support 9 separate ice ages at least, the average separation of which is between 50 and 110,000 years. So, correct. It was always intact, yes. The movement of fauna of South American origin north, the movement of North American originating fauna south, is documented throughout that period of time. So yes, it was always there.
Why does it take so long and cost so much?
Hopefully you saw in those images one of the things we were trying to do. Now, for every hour you spend actually excavating, you're going to spend 15 hours documenting the site. You're going to be taking countless photographs, recording countless thousands of pages of field notes, because if we can't tell somebody who was unconnected with the project exactly what we found and exactly how we found it, we shouldn't be doing it at all. Unfortunately, we also wanted to answer questions which had proven vexatious to the original excavators, which required reliance on now time-honored excavation and documentation protocols, which are frankly tedious and which appeal to only the demented, okay? If you can imagine sitting down 12 hours a day, 6 days a week with a single-edged razor blade in your hand and not be a devotee of your favorite scotch at the end of the process, then you can understand why it takes such a long time. Secondly, it's expensive for several reasons. Those Arctic weather ports by themselves are like $50,000 creations. When you take into account the salaries of the excavators, when you take into account the instrumentation that's used to excavate the laser transits or the laser theodolites, when you especially take into account the cost of the instrumentation used for radiocarbon dating and other forms of elemental analysis, you begin to appreciate why archaeology is such a costly pastime. And in fact, I would suggest to you, and your presence here indicates that you appreciate that it is far more than just a pastime. We believe that in fact, archaeology serves to illuminate the human past in ways that no other field can. And if you don't know where you've been as a species, you can't know how you got here, and you sure as hell can't know where you're going. And that's why we think it's worth spending this much money and this much time to figure it out.
Plans to go ahead with other?
Yes, the question is, are we planning on additional excavations? Not at the immediate Old Vero locality itself. We think those excavations are pretty well exhausted. But nearby, at other potential Ice Age or post-Ice Age locations, we hope to do sufficient testing and generate sufficient funds to be able to look at, in whatever time frame it fits, the prehistory of this portion of the Tri-County area. Why did I become an archaeologist? My mother was a historian who was the first in her family to attend college or university. She was a 4-field major at Marietta College in Ohio. She programmed me to do this. I learned to read geology and paleontology books before I ever went to kindergarten. And consequently, I never wanted to be anything else except what I have unfortunately become. So I was made to be this way.
What is a projectile point, and how is a Clovis point dated?
A projectile point is simply the tip, a stone tip of a foreshaft, which is a detachable part of a composite spear, or can be attached to the main shaft of a spear. And it basically provides, as you might guess, the same thing a modern metal arrowhead or metal point does. Easier entrance and exit from the critter that you're trying to kill. Obviously, the broader the projectile point, the greater the hemorrhage factor. It makes you bleed more. It's why, unless you're a professional assassin, you prefer to stab somebody with a larger instead of a smaller knife. And projectile points can be dated not directly by radiocarbon because they're not organic, but by being found on the same surface or associated with things that can be dated. And we know from countless archaeological sites in North, Central, and parts of South America that Clovis points are found on surfaces which tend to date between 10,900 and 11,500 radiocarbon years ago, or roughly 13,000 to 13,500 calendar years ago.
Why did several animals go extinct?
There are two hypotheses about this, or actually three. One of them is, and this was generated, and I might say this, by male archaeologists and male paleontologists who like to fancy themselves to be the greatest hunters, or at least the descendants of the greatest hunters who ever lived, who prefer to think we, the males among us, killed off all the Ice Age fauna. Whereas the other view says that they were already stressed by some of these climatic changes we talked about. Their biology had been sufficiently impinged upon that their reproductive success was highly variable and that they became extinct essentially because of climatic change. The third argument combines the two and says these populations were declining already and we put the finishing touches on them. We kill off the handful that are left. The simple fact of the matter is, as was pointed out by European scholars at the time the Clovis model first became popular, and by South Americans, the Europeans said, wait a minute, no killing event like this has ever occurred in the history of the world. The South American guy said, we have artifacts as old as Clovis, and they're completely unrelated to it. And what was the U.S. and Canadian response? Those guys on the other side of the Atlantic have no idea what they're talking about. Those guys in South America don't even speak English. And consequently, we ignored something we should have appreciated, that humans were not the direct cause of most of the Ice Age extinctions.
When was the first Ice Age?
The first Ice Age occurs based on those deep sea cores about 2.4 million years ago during the previous geological period called the Pliocene.
So if the ground is undisturbed, how deep would you have to go to get to the first Ice Age?
It all depends on how much sediment has accumulated since Ice Age sediments may have been emplaced at a particular locality. We had to dig as deep as we dug at Vero for several reasons, not the least of which was the post-construction accumulation of material that occurred since 1915, and the other was because the overbanking of Van Valkenburg Creek was constantly laying down fresh sediment in fresh layers and making it much thicker than it would otherwise be in an area where, say, only wind was depositing the sedimentary matrix.
You mentioned the Melbourne site and the Cape Canaveral site. What, if anything, different was found there than in the Vero site?
Well, at Melbourne, originally, Ice Age animal bones and human remains were found, again, allegedly in association. But as you look carefully at the data, it appears to be like the Vero locality in that the human remains are later in time than the Ice Age skeletal remains, and that they, in fact, were emplaced in an underwater situation similar to the remains at Windover. The excavations at the Windover Bog changed our perception entirely of Florida archaeology and Florida Native Americans in the last 7,500 years. It used to be believed before Glenn Doran's meticulous excavations at that locality in the 80s that at that time, 7,500, 7,000 years ago, calendar years ago, that the Native American populations in Florida were either not sufficiently numerous to have cemeteries, nor sufficiently complex to make things like that woven cloth I showed you. In point of fact, they not only were sufficiently numerous, but their lifestyles were sufficiently complicated that they produced those kinds of fabrics and many other kinds of things infinitely more complicated than any of us would have believed a mere 20 years ago. That's the dynamic part of archaeology. It's always changing. It's always casting new light on what our ancestors did, and it's always making us appreciate better how the past actually transpired because of the refinement in technologies, because of the refinement in analytical techniques that lets us ask better questions of the data and to answer those questions better than we could yesterday, for that matter.
How tall were ancient humans?
Most of us in this room are taller than the average archaic or Paleo-Indian person, but this is probably, for the most part, nutritional. It appears that in some areas where the nutritional base provided as many as 3,200 or 3,500 calories a day, what you might get if you had 6 of those 17-layer desserts, those folk can be as tall as the taller among us today. What is dramatically different is the longevity issue. While some people, few in number, could be expected to be 50, 60, 70, 80, or 90 years old, the vast majority of folks have lifespans that are far shorter, and the vast majority of folks are being afflicted by ailments which, if untreated, would have probably killed most of us. If you, in fact, happen to wear glasses or contacts, you might as well have been dead when you were 20. If, in fact, you've had any kind of disease that you had to be treated in the hospital, you would not have made it to whatever age you are now. And, of course, with infant mortality being in excess of 50%, like hunter-gatherer infant mortality is, and with female mortality in the birthing process being what it was, you had short life expectancies. And so, consequently, the old would have been the valued exception to the normal longevity trajectory.
Is carbon dating an exact or a soft measurement?
No, it's an exact measurement, especially as it has become more refined, and now that we can control for all the variables that affect the amount of radiocarbon that are contained in the atmosphere. Now that we can use accelerator mass spectrometry, we can actually count individual molecules or atoms of radiocarbon to determine the age of an item.
The question goes on to say, would it not be fires or volcanoes or variants of other cosmic rays that might affect that data?
Well, that's when radiocarbon dating was originally invented at the University of Chicago as a spin-off of the atomic bomb project. They made a series of assumptions about the constancy of the radiocarbon reservoir in the atmosphere, about the non-effect of volcanic activity and the explosion of thermonuclear devices and that sort of thing, all of which have proven to be wrong. And consequently, since we know they're wrong, we can now correct raw dates or calibrate them into what they actually seem to represent, because if you look at tree rings, the long tree ring record that we have that goes back way more than 11,000 years, you can actually date individual tree rings, and you know this ring was added to that tree in 86 AD. And if the radiocarbon date is 200 BC, you know the difference.
There's a theory that people came from Europe across the ocean to come to the United States. Is that true or not?
Recently, well, within the last decade and a half, on the heels of the collapse of Clovis First, all sorts of ideas have been generated about potential arrival dates and potential arrival directions. One of these was the hypothesis by Dennis Stanford at the Smithsonian and Bruce Bradley at the University of Exeter in England that the North Atlantic was traversed at a time commensurate with the appearance of proto-Clovis technology. They think that using boats at a time when the ice extended further south than Iceland now, that going across the North Atlantic would have been relatively easy, which incidentally it would have been, and that populations arrived here along the Atlantic coast of the American Southeast and introduced Solutrean technology to the Native Americans who may have arrived here by the traditional routes across or south of the Bering Straits. Most American archaeologists are skeptical that the evidence is sufficient at the moment to demonstrate that fact. It remains one of the interesting newer things that has come up in the last 15, 20 years.
Wasn't it something to do with the stones that were found?
Well,
points
right.
that were
The
found?
technology of the Solutrean artifacts are alleged by Bruce Bradley, who was a master stonesmith himself, to be incapable of being invented twice. That the kind of flaking represented on these Solutrean tools from the coasts of Portugal, France, and Spain, and then again that appear with Clovis technologies and proto-Clovis technologies in the New World, were the result of the diffusion of that technology, not independent invention. Most Europeans who have examined the two sets of artifacts, the stone tools from the US and the stone tools from Europe, don't agree, but in any case, nor did people agree with Sellards, for that matter.
That was the last question. We understand everything now.
Perfect. Thank you. I should point out for the benefit of Mr. Gunter that I did not put on this coat to appear to be more civilized, and that I normally would not be wearing it at all.